Revealed, how I disappeared after my son demanded I pay his wife's shocking $300K debt. The words lingered in the air, twisting like smoke. Richard's heart sank as Jake's firm gaze locked onto his. $300,000. The idea was absurd, a weight far too heavy for Richard to lift. After all those years beneath the hood of cars in Cedar Grove, where laughter danced with the smell of baked pies, this was not the future he had dreamed for his son that he had sacrificed so much. Countless nights of work, missed meals, and every penny poured into Jake's education, what had it all been for? And yet, here was Jake, freshly graduated, carrying a burden he didn't know how to share. Richard's chest tightened when he recalled late nights in the garage, bonding over grease and the dreams of a better life. But as the request settled on his shoulders, the very essence of that bond felt frayed, wearing thin under the strain of family loyalty and self-respect that he hesitated, searching for the right words, the right response. With each passing second, doubt crept in. Did he owe this debt? Was it fair to sacrifice everything he'd built for a life spent teaching Jake the value of hard work? As he wrestled with the turmoil, memories swirled in his mind. The soccer games, the father-son talks over hamburger dinners, the pride swelling as he watched Jake walk across that stage, cap and gown billowing like the promise of a brighter future. But now? The weight of the request dragged him down, an anchor made of guilt and obligation. The hard-earned values instilled by his own father screamed inside him. Family first, always. Yet the specter of his father's pride now felt like an insurmountable wall, blocking the way to true support. What would it mean to say no? The internal conflict spread like wildfire. He could almost feel the heat washing over him, pulse racing. Before we continue, I need to tell you about something important that's happening. YouTube has been making changes to the system and many people are losing notifications from channels they follow. If you're enjoying the content, click the bell and mark all notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And if you can leave a like, it really helps with reach. Seriously, it makes a difference. Oh, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to know who's on the other side of the screen. Now let's continue. Richard felt torn as he clenched his fists, working to keep the tumult at bay. Disappearing seemed the only option, but was that truly support? Retreating to his workshop offered a false sense of relief, the familiar sound of chiseling wood, the simple beauty in creating something tangible. But every stroke of the chisel was tainted with the ache of regret and guilt. Jake's face haunted him. Had he taught him to expect too much? As Richard labored, creating pieces shaped by both lineage and love, resentment began to bubble, the pressure mounted. Their relationship, once a firm handhold, was beginning to slip through his fingers. He felt the distance widen, and his resolve wavered. When he finally returned home, the chill in the air was palpable, tension clinging to the walls. Words hung unspoken, but the truth loomed larger than life. Just then, an unexpected knock at the door echoed, jarring him from his spiral of thoughts. Richard took a moment, breath caught in his throat, bracing for whatever came next. The storm was brewing, and the last thing he wanted was to confront the truth. Would he be ready to face Jake, ready to ask the questions that had been building like a dam ready to burst? The door swung open, revealing Jake, his expression a mixture of determination and vulnerability. Richard felt a ripple of warmth and anxiety crash through him. This wasn't just a conversation about money anymore, it was a collision of dreams, expectations, and long-held fears. "Dad, can we talk?" Jake's voice trembled slightly, revealing an emotion that belied his confident outward facade. Richard nodded, stepping aside to let his son enter. The two of them moved slowly to the living room, where remnants of their past, the framed diplomas, family photos cast shadows of memory across the walls. Jake sank into the couch, fingers tangling in his hair. The moment stretched agonizingly, filled with everything they weren't saying. Richard paced, the wooden floor creaking beneath him, mirroring his restless thoughts. "I didn't mean to put all this on you," Jake finally said, voice breaking the tension like a snapped rubber band. I didn't know who else to turn to. It feels like everything is collapsing." Richard's heart clenched. That sense of helplessness in Jake's voice resonated deeply with him. "You should have come to me earlier." We could have talked it through, he replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. I didn't want to burden you. You've already sacrificed so much, Jake said, eyes downcast. It was the truth, yet it felt like a knife turning in Richard's gut. It was his duty to defend Jake's future, but at what cost to his sense of self? In that stillness, Richard's mind shifted rapidly. Could he be the father that built bridges instead of walls? He had taught Jake that hard work means everything, yet here was this test of loyalty. How could love manifest when caught between obligation and principles? Do you think I'd be proud of you if you sacrificed everything just because of this debt? Richard pressed. Pride isn't just about money, it's about values. Teach your wife those values too. Jake's gaze hardened. You think I don't see the irony? I've worked hard all my life, and yet here I am, on the brink of drowning in someone else's choices. Richard inhaled sharply. The truth stung. Jake's perspective displayed a vulnerability that hit close to home. He took a seat beside him, the tension inviting a conversation beyond the surface. What if, Richard began, weighing his words carefully, there's another way. What if you learn to stand up for yourself and fight against this? You're not alone, you have your family. Eyes brightening, Jake considered his words. But how do I do that? I feel so defeated. Start small. Identify what your limits are. If you think taking this debt is a burden, then don't accept it. Clarity dawned on Richard, sparks lighting up his own realizations. He had never considered this situation from Jake's perspective, one of agency, not just obligation. And if that affects your relationship? Jake challenged, a hint of rebellion creeping into his tone. Then you face it. Open that dialogue. It's not about just one decision, it's about how you navigate life together. Isn't that what partnership is? In that moment, Richard felt a shift within himself. Hide and retreat had always felt like safe options, but confronting this challenge could yield strength beyond anything he had known. No more being a passive player in life's game, it was time to engage. As they spoke, a newfound understanding bloomed between them, tethering their shared fears but also illuminating paths of potential. Richard could sense the emotional boundaries beginning to shift as the walls of communication started to come down. But before they could explore further, a silence descended. The weight of the impending conversation was palpable, a fragile thread binding their fates. Richard steeled himself for the next words that would emerge. The questions that still lingered were ready to surface. Dad, Jake hesitated, searching for the strength to ask something pivotal. What if I can't handle this without your help? What if it costs me everything? The stakes had never felt greater, the turning point between falling into the shadows or stepping into the light, hanging on the precipice of that very moment. But Richard realized, they could build a future together not through sacrifice, but by forging a new path together. Was he ready for the truth about himself? The moment had arrived to face the choices before him, and Richard found that he had one last question to pose. What if we worked on this together? Richard held his breath as he awaited Jake's response, acutely aware that the air in the room was thick with unsaid words and unconsidered possibilities. The moment felt pivotal, a nexus of their emotional landscape. Jake's expression shifted as he processed his father's suggestion, flickering between hope and doubt. Together? Jake echoed, eyebrows knitting together in disbelief. What does that even mean? How can you help me with something like this? It means we redefine what help looks like, Richard said, words slowly forming in his mind. Instead of just bearing the burden, we tackle it as a team. You have ideas, I have experience. Maybe between us, we can find a viable way forward. As he spoke, an unexpected clarity washed over Richard. He no longer saw himself merely as a provider wrapped in financial responsibilities, but as a partner in Jake's journey. This perception shift propelled him forward. The fear of inadequacy began to morph into a determination to guide them both through this labyrinth of debt. Jake's shoulders dropped slightly, a glimmer of relief breaking through. I've never even thought about that. I always felt I had to figure this out on my own. The weight of his admission hung heavily in the air, a poised blade threatening to drop into vulnerability. Richard nodded, internalizing Jake's words. It dawned on him that he, too, had harbored a belief that seeking help was a sign of weakness. He realized this moment wasn't just about addressing Jake's financial crisis, it was about breaking down the walls that had kept them stuck in isolation. What if we made a list? Richard offered, a sudden spark igniting his thoughts. Let us get everything down: the costs, the potential solutions, personal limits. We can brainstorm options together. Maybe that will help you feel less overwhelmed and give us a direction. The chairs around them inhabited the silence, but it was a silence tinged with a new hope. Jake straightened, unraveling the tension that had clenched his muscles throughout the conversation. You know, I used to think making a plan was just piling on more worry, but that might just work. Richard felt a warmth spreading through him. He realized their relationship was undergoing a metamorphosis as they began to negotiate both their fears and their aspirations. They weren't just father and son locked in a cycle of obligation, they were co-authors of a shared narrative that welcomed strength through collaboration, but the swelling joy was tempered by the knowledge that the intimidating debt still loomed like a storm cloud overhead. Richard began to wonder about the next practical steps. We might also need to have a discussion with your wife. Maybe she has ideas, too. It's important that she feels part of this conversation. This is her burden as well. Jake's brow furrowed. I don't know if she'll be open to that. She's too proud to admit she needs help right now. Richard paused, strategizing. Then our goal is to create a space for her, one where she can see that collaboration isn't about weakness but strength. You have to communicate through this fog of pride. As his heart raced with possibilities, Richard realized how much personal growth he had experienced in a short span of time. He wasn't merely reacting anymore, he was working towards a solution, encouraging Jake to embrace the uncomfortable truths, learning to share burdens instead of shielding them. But underneath this wave of optimism, Richard sensed an undercurrent of anxiety. What if their efforts to confront the situation brought more conflict than resolution? His own past made him acutely aware of how unresolved struggles could fracture relationships. Jake, he said cautiously, grounding his thoughts in the reality of their conversation. What if this doesn't go as we hope? What if approaching her ends up making things worse? Jake looked at him, uncertainty morphing into determination. Then we assess and adapt. It's not about perfection but about growth, right? The sound of faith echoed in Jake's voice, undeniable yet precarious. Suddenly, Richard realized that in supporting his son, he too was unearthing buried layers of doubt and resilience within himself, an uncharted territory fraught with risk but rich in potential. Each moment felt like riding a tightrope, the ground of certainty vanishing beneath them. But perhaps walking together into this fray would illuminate hidden opportunities they had long overlooked. As they began to sketch a roadmap for their shared journey, Richard felt a shroud of liberation start to lift. He was no longer regarding the shadows of obligation but stepping into the light of agency alongside his son. But just as optimism began to bloom, a thought lurked: what if the very confrontation they were preparing for unraveled hidden truths that would shatter everything they knew about their family dynamics? Richard stared at the blank page before him, his hands hovering over the scattered notes and figures that represented a world he once deemed incomprehensible. The act of writing out a plan felt simultaneously liberating and paralyzing. How could numbers transform into a feasible way forward when the very idea of confronting Jake's wife seemed destined to draw forth a tempest of resentment and fear? He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. The weight of his past circumstances pressed upon him, a reminder of failures that were all too vivid. Richard had spent years living in a bubble of security, believing that keeping quiet and carrying burdens alone was a mark of strength. But as he observed Jake, resolute yet trembling with uncertainty, Richard understood that his previous attitudes would only sabotage their potential growth. Let us start by listing everything, he urged again, his voice steadier than the turbulence within. Income, expenses, obligations. What will it take to get back on track? Jake, invigorated by the prospect of a plan, grabbed the notepad, intent on penning their first collaborative effort. Richard watched as Jake's brow furrowed in concentration, reflecting the internal struggle of balancing pragmatism with the emotional toll ahead. The first bulleted item appeared: monthly payments to creditors. Richard felt his heart drop. He was steeped in the reality of their situation, overwhelmed by both the sheer volume of debt and the likelihood of confrontation with his daughter-in-law. What would he say to her? Would she resent him for fleshing out these unflattering realities? Or would he be welcomed as a lifeline in the storm? Mortgage payment. Car loan. Credit cards, Jake continued listing, his handwriting growing larger as frustration mounted. He paused, brow knitted tight. And we can call Sam tonight, can't we? Make sure she's included? Richard hesitated. The suggestion sent a chill through his spine. Was this the moment for that talk? The thought of confronting Sam's pride brought a rapid beat to his pulse. You know, Jake, it might be better to draft a list together and present it. If she sees that you're willing to tackle this as a united front, it might soften her a bit. But what if she lashes out? Jake's voice wavered, the uncertainty creeping back in. Richard clenched his fists, wrestling with the burgeoning impulse to protect both his son and daughter-in-law from potential pain. Yet he also recognized that denying their next step would lead them back to isolation, a position too familiar for him, one he had endured for far too long alone. Sometimes the confrontation is needed, Jake. It can be the catalyst for healing or growth. Their eyes locked, a shared understanding unfurling amid their fears. Richard recognized the brilliance in Jake's attempt to pull Sam into the conversation, to invite her into their journey. This collaboration, though daunting, could transform isolation into connection should they manage to navigate the turbulent waters carefully. Let us do this, Jake declared, a newfound resolve settling in his demeanor. We can do this together. He jotted down the last of the items on their document, staring down at the accumulated list, but Richard felt turbulence churn inside him, the implications of their actions far heavier than the weight of any single debt. Would they unravel Sam's tightly wound pride, or would they awaken demons of discontent that could devastate their family structure? As Jake reviewed their work, Richard pondered the brewing storm ahead. Perhaps this exercise in collaboration would strip away the veils that hindered their authentic family connections. Or perhaps the confrontation would fracture what had long remained unexamined. The time had come to face the darker elements of their lives, a reckoning that lay just ahead. With each breath, Richard felt the wind of transformation whispering at the edges of his thoughts. Finally, he realized it was not just Sam's pride on the line, it was the very fabric of their relationships, woven through shared burdens and blended fears. There was no way to predict the outcome, but the stakes were becoming clearer. Richard met Jake's gaze, an unspoken agreement solidifying between them. They were preparing to venture into the unknown together, each step taken in trust and vulnerability. As the shadows of uncertainty loomed, Richard wondered if the roads they were about to tread would forge new depths in their family bond or unveil layers of truth that would unravel them. The moment felt electric, charged with the potential for both chaos and clarity. Would confrontation lead to understanding, or would it pierce the veil of their familial cohesion, sending them spiraling into despair? They stood at the threshold of change, stepping toward a confrontation that lingered just beyond the door. With a deep breath, Richard felt the thrill of agency, knowing that, for better or worse, everything was about to shift. Richard watched the clock tick, each second unfurling into a tapestry of mounting tensions and unresolved fears. They were poised to confront a reality that could shatter or solidify their family. The unyielding silence in the room felt like a pressure cooker, with both men floundering in their own apprehensions. Jake, Richard finally began, his voice a mixture of gravity and warmth. I know this must feel daunting, but I want you to think about how you feel about including Sam in this conversation. Jake shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping restlessly against the table. She has to know, he conceded, but unease flickered in his eyes. But what if she can't handle it? What if it all just blows up? Richard nodded, acknowledging the embedded fears. Part of him wished to offer Jake reassurances, perhaps words promising that everything would turn out fine. Yet deep down, he realized that this moment wasn't about comfort, it was about the messy realities of life and the necessity of facing them head-on. Sometimes addressing the truth is the only way to remove the burdens that weigh us down. It's not just about Sam, it's also for you to reclaim the life you want. The notion that confronting the situation could also be liberating for Jake hung in the air, heavy yet hopeful. Richard marveled at the emotional terrain he was traversing. This journey forward required far more than pragmatic planning. It was about unearthing deeper truths. Feeling a rush of energy, Richard straightened up, his analytical mind calculating the next steps. They needed to create a clear narrative, one that conveyed their intent without drowning in emotional chaos. How about we write down our concerns about how Sam might react? If we can outline her potential objections, it may help us navigate the conversation better. Jake studied him, seeming to appreciate the strategy. Okay, I'm in. He grabbed the pen again, flipping to a clean sheet. She's likely to feel betrayed, maybe angry, he started timidly. What if she thinks we're blaming her for this debt? Richard bit his lip, a familiar frustration creeping up. That's fair, but we're not blaming. This as an opportunity for everyone to participate in a solution. As Jake considered the insights Richard shared, he began writing furiously, making every point tangible. The transformation in his demeanor was palpable. Richard could see him shaking off anxiety in favor of purpose. Okay, now let us target solutions, Richard prompted, leaning in. What can we do if Sam reacts poorly? We need a plan. I guess we could gently remind her we're all in this together, Jake suggested, his confidence gradually building. And perhaps talk about how there are better options than ignoring the problem. Richard smiled at Jake's acumen. This was more than just about facing Sam, it was about claiming their space, building a bridge towards accountability and authentic dialogue. Each word gained weight and meaning, establishing a pathway towards the resolution they sought. However, as they fleshed out their strategy, Richard couldn't shake a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. He realized it wasn't just about supporting Jake or Sam, he was confronting his own demons, the years spent in isolation and silence. Here was an opportunity not merely for Jake, but for him too. He could redefine the legacy he wanted to leave behind, but the clock continued ticking, leaving echoes of urgency in the air as the moment drew closer. What if confronting these difficult truths unleashed a wave of animosity instead of the support they so desperately sought? What if it shattered the fragile connections they had built? Richard sighed and gathered his notes, gripping them tightly. This endeavor would test his newfound resolve, leaving the door wide open for breakthroughs or breakdowns. Ready or not, here we go, he murmured under his breath just as his phone vibrated across the table. Sam was calling. With one glance at Jake, Richard saw the mixture of determination and fear reflected in his son's eyes. This was it, there would be no turning back now. As Richard pressed accept, an unshakable reality dawned upon him. The circumstance they were about to navigate required vulnerability, a deep breath, and perhaps, just perhaps, the embrace of an uncertain future. Richard inhaled sharply, the moment hanging like a thin veil of anticipation in the air. As he placed the phone to his ear, the familiar sound of Sam's voice broke through the tension, the tone laced with uncertainty and a faint tremor. It was evident she sensed the gravity of the situation, even if she didn't know the details. Dad? Can we talk? Sam's voice was tentative, yet there was a hint of a steely resolve lurking beneath. Of course, sweetheart. We were just waiting for you to call, Richard replied, fighting to keep his composure steady despite the tempest raging inside him. He cast a glance at Jake, whose eyes were wide, full of questions yet spoken with silent understanding. There was no turning back now. The chatter of the outside world faded as Richard focused entirely on Sam. What's on your mind? He managed to ask, feeling the weight of their shared history hanging between them, binding them to every unresolved issue. I heard some things, about money and... Jake, she hesitated, the line crackling with her uncertainty. I just want to understand what is going on. I'm worried. Sam, we all need to talk, and it's going to be difficult, Richard said carefully, gauging how much to reveal without overwhelming her. Your dad and I were just discussing some family matters that pertain to all of us. Silence lingered just a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Richard's heart raced, grappling with the impending conversation. This was not merely about money. It was an opening, an opportunity, for clarity and perhaps healing. Okay, Sam replied slowly. I'm listening. Just tell me what I need to know. Richard steeled himself. There's a lot to unpack, and it's time for us to face the reality of your situation. We need to talk about the debt. As he spoke, Richard felt layers of tension peel away from his shoulders, realizing he had long avoided these conversations, first with Sam, and later, even with himself. Now, articulating the truth felt like clearing a fog, a necessary step towards understanding and, more importantly, growth. Debt? My debt, or is this about Jake's parents? Sam's voice trembled slightly, revealing the fragility hidden beneath her bravado. Your debt. We need to talk about how it affects all of us. Richard felt the impulse to shatter the emotional distance that had grown over the years. This was his chance to bridge the gap, to confront the issues head-on instead of allowing them to spiral further. I don't know what to say, Dad, she stuttered, swallowing the vulnerability he felt echoing within her words. I thought we were managing everything. No one told me it had gotten this bad. Jake leaned in, trying to catch his father's eye, reminding Richard silently that their goal was collective understanding, not blame. Sam, he interjected gently, we're not here to point fingers. We want to help you, but we need to face it together. We're family. Richard paused as Jake's words hung in the air, a combination of reassurance and a defining moment for both father and son. They were becoming allies in a shared mission, the liberation of truth. This mutual understanding allowed Richard to see in Jake what he had ever yearned for: collaboration, vulnerability, and grace. After everything that has happened, it's easy to feel lost, Richard ventured, looking deeper into her emotions, searching for the truth that would pave this new path. But what if we can take this moment and turn it into a collective solution? We've been very silent about issues that affect us. Suddenly, a spark ignited in Sam's eyes, a flicker of resolve sharpened by situational clarity. So what's next? How do we fix this? Richard took a deep breath and moved step by step into the territory they had all avoided for far too long. He began contemplating how they each might engage with the issue, how their words could transform despair into a newfound determination. We can start by laying everything on the table. No secrets. In that moment, Richard understood, this was no longer about debts or money. This was a turning point. They were beginning to dismantle the barriers, opening channels that had long been closed. They would have the painful conversations, but they would do it together. But as they tentatively stepped into that daunting reality, Richard couldn't ignore the seeds of unrest still lurking beneath the surface. What other unspoken fears awaited them? What resentment had festered in the confines of silence? Richard's heart raced at the thought of what was still hidden, the truths waiting to surface, like dormant landmines in the battlefield of their family dynamics. Would they be ready to confront everything that lay buried? As uncertainty shadowed their path forward, the weight of responsibility pressed down on Richard. Each word carried meaning, each decision could alter the course of their relationships forever. The moment of reckoning was near, and deep within, he braced himself, knowing that their journey was only just beginning. The air crackled with tension as Richard set the phone down, leaving a silence that felt both suffocating and liberating. He glanced at Jake, who had witnessed the raw emotional intensity of their conversation. The journey they had just embarked upon had the potential to reshape everything they understood about their family dynamics. Richard felt the urgency of the moment. It was not just about Sam's debts, but about crafting a new narrative for them all. Dad, Jake said carefully, drawing Richard's attention. What if Sam feels entirely overwhelmed? This is big. Richard nodded, recognizing the undeniable truth in Jake's words. It was not just Sam's struggle. It resonated across the entire family, echoing deeper issues they had all sidestepped for too long. I know, son. But avoiding the conversation only adds to the uncertainty. It won't be easy, but we need to be honest with one another. We can't be afraid to face our realities. He could sense the change in the atmosphere, a shift from fear to determination. The emotional fog was lifting, but that didn't erase the fear of potential fallout. Richard's thoughts began to race. What if addressing the debt opened a floodgate of deeper grievances? Could they confront the layers of resentment and unspoken disappointment that lay just beneath the surface? Dad, Jake interrupted Richard's train of thought, his voice steady. Do you think focusing on the debt will lead to other issues? Like Mom's absence? The mention of his late wife struck a chord deep within him. Her absence wasn't just a void but a mirror reflecting their unresolved pain. Yes, Richard admitted, his heart heavy. But it's important. The longer we disregard our feelings about her, the longer we remain shackled to the past. This moment felt pivotal. Richard recognized his own role in the familial narrative. He had shied away from grief, suppressing it behind walls built from denial and avoidance. Yet, perhaps it was time to dismantle those defenses. We need to bring everything to light, Jake. It's time for all of us to grieve, to forgive, and to move forward together. Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing Richard's words. What if we don't know how? What if bringing it all up changes everything? That's exactly the risk we must take, Richard responded, his voice firm. Change is often forged in discomfort. We've been stagnant for too long, and we can't grow without challenging the status quo. Feeling an unsettling mix of fear and determination within, Richard pondered their next steps. He drew up a mental map, opened the lines of communication with Sam, tackle the debt within the context of their shared family struggle, and confront the emotional scars left by their mother's absence. He envisioned a family meeting, an honest, no-holds-barred confrontation of their realities. It was the foundation they needed to redefine their connections. Shall we set a time to talk to her? Richard suggested, heart racing at the prospect. The personal stakes felt astronomical, but he realized he was no longer paralyzed by fear. Instead, he was stepping into his role as a father, prepared to lead them through the turbulent waters of honesty and vulnerability. Yeah. Let us do it, Jake said, his resolve echoing Richard's newfound determination, but as he stared into Jake's eyes, Richard felt a nagging fear lingering in the back of his mind. What other unresolved conflicts and hidden resentments lay dormant? How had they all, under the guise of normalcy, built walls to protect their hearts, only to find themselves increasingly isolated? As Richard stood at this crossroads, he grasped the full magnitude of the challenge ahead. The way forward was fraught with uncertainty. Yet for the first time in a long while, he was focused on something other than himself, on the future of his family. Richard exhaled slowly as he transitioned from contemplation to action, understanding that this would be their moment of reckoning. Each decision would require courage, every conversation fraught with potential upheaval, but each step was necessary to reconstruct their family. And as they prepared to move forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a far more intricate journey. But would they have the strength and the willingness to confront what lay beneath the surface in their next family meeting? The mere thought left Richard's heart pounding and full of anticipation as they set the plans into motion. Richard felt the heaviness of the moment settle over him like a thick blanket as he and Jake made their way to the living room. The familiar surroundings, the worn couch, the coffee table cluttered with old magazines, felt alien now. He couldn't shake the feeling that every detail of their home was a part of a facade that had kept them comfortable but stagnant. It was time to tear it down. As they settled in, Richard took a deep breath, his mind whirling with the upcoming conversation. Resolute, he reminded himself of the goal: honesty and connection. He glanced at Jake, who appeared equally pensive. Let us make an outline, Richard suggested, pulling out a notepad and pen. He scribbled family meeting agenda at the top, followed by a few bullet points: Sam's debt, discussing mom, setting expectations, and plans for moving forward. The list provided a semblance of order amidst the chaos brewing in his mind. Jake watched quietly, his brow furrowed in thought. What if the conversation turns into a fight? What if Sam just lashes out? Richard paused, considering his son's concerns. He shared the same fears but knew they had to push through. We can't control how she reacts, but we can control how we respond. We have to stay grounded and focused on finding solutions, he replied, looking firmly into Jake's eyes, each word weighed heavily against the backdrop of their impending confrontation. Richard felt a certain thrill, a spark of adrenaline. It was a complicated cocktail of fear, determination, and an odd sense of clarity. For the first time in years, he felt he was embarking on a journey of discovery, both for himself and for his family. As they outlined potential responses to grievances that might arise, Richard found himself confronting his own fears. Not just regarding the debt itself, but how he had failed, for so long, to connect with Sam and Jake in meaningful ways. Like both of them, he had buried emotions, rationalized his silence, and overlooked the importance of vulnerability. Dad, what if we establish some ground rules? Jake suggested. We should agree on how we communicate. No blame, no shouting. Just facts on the table. Richard nodded, appreciating Jake's growing maturity. That's brilliant. We need a calm environment if we're going to unravel this mess. But even as they created these guidelines, Richard contemplated his own tendencies to react defensively when challenged. Would he be able to resist the impulse to protect himself when the discussion turned to his devotion to their mother? To admit his ongoing grief and loneliness? It dawned on him that avoiding such discussions had not only pushed him and Jake further apart but also left Sam in isolation, struggling without their support. The next hour was spent solidifying their strategies. Jake would take the lead in opening the discussion with Sam, giving Richard the opportunity to jump in later when emotions escalated. It was a deliberately constructed plan, yet Richard felt the seeds of doubt sprout within him. Could he genuinely put aside his own discomfort for the sake of unity? Later that evening, when Richard kissed Jake goodnight, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the possibilities of their family meeting in his mind. What would Sam say? How would it unfold? But beneath those concerns lay a deeper question. What would he discover about himself? It was deeply unsettling to admit that he had hidden away elements of his soul, fearing judgment or rejection. Wasn't he at time to confront those shadows? Determination welled inside him, and as he finally drifted off, the weight of anticipation nestling in his chest, he realized that confronting his family's struggles wasn't just the start of a family reconciliation. It was also the first step in reclaiming his own narrative. The next day was laden with expectation. As Richard paced the kitchen, waiting for Sam to arrive, he felt the dawning realization that the meeting wasn't just about addressing debts or grievances. It was a pivotal moment for him, a chance to demonstrate his growth, to be vulnerable, to show his family that he was willing to face the truth in pursuit of something better. Their conversation would be a risk, but what Richard didn't know was that this breakthrough could unearth hidden truths, and with those truths came the risk of exposing unimagined revelations. How would they all react when the walls of pretense began to crumble? Would they be able to absorb the impact of the past, or would it drive them further into isolation? Richard's heart raced as he heard the familiar sounds of Sam's car in the driveway, shaking off the last remnants of doubt and stepping boldly into the unknown. Richard stood by the kitchen window, the sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting a warm glow across the countertop but failing to warm the cool anxiety coiling in his stomach. In the distance, he could see Sam's car come to a stop, the engine's quiet hum echoing louder than his own rapid heartbeat. He clenched his fists on the counter and took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been preparing for, yet the enormity of it felt insurmountable. The agenda in his mind morphed into questions. What if she didn't understand? What if this led to yet another fracture in their family? Jake entered the room, offering a tentative, reassuring smile. You all right, Dad? Just thinking, Richard replied, though the term felt weak in comparison to the turmoil warring inside him. The fear of confrontation felt reminiscent of his father, who often resorted to silence rather than engaging. Was he about to become a mirror of his past? As Sam stepped through the door, she offered a half-hearted wave. Richard felt the shift in the air. They were no longer just family but stakeholders in a delicate negotiation, each holding a piece of a greater whole. He could sense the tension rising in the room, unspoken words hanging like suspended smoke. Hey, Sam, Jake said, motioning her to sit down. Thanks for coming. We wanted to talk about everything. Yeah, everything, Sam echoed, but her voice lacked conviction. She slumped into a chair, crossing her arms defensively. Richard, swallowing hard, stepped in to break the ice. We've outlined a few things we want to address, but the first step is just for us to talk openly, without blame. He paused, feeling the weight of his own words, hoping his voice didn't waver. We care about you, Sam, and we need to work through this together. As he spoke, he observed her closely. Her eyes flickered with vulnerability, and for a moment, he thought he saw the younger version of his daughter, the one who once grabbed him for piggyback rides and trusted him to fix her broken toys. But now, she seemed so far away, locked behind layers of hardship and disappointment. Why did you even want to get involved? Sam suddenly shot back, her voice tinged with defensiveness. It's my problem, not yours. Richard felt the swift jab in his chest, but rather than heeding his anger, it froze him in place. He hadn't anticipated her retaliatory words. They cut deeper than expected, exposing the raw nerve of paternal instincts. Jake shifted uncomfortably beside him, but Richard found a voice, leaning into this moment. Because I'm your father. I want to help, even if it feels like I'm crossing a line or getting too involved. As Richard attempted to convey his genuine concern, he recognized a paradigm shift in himself, a new perspective emerging from the turmoil. For years, he had felt powerless, unable to connect or offer support in a meaningful way. Each resentment had built a wall, and breaking that wall down demanded vulnerability that once eluded him. Dad, there's so much more, Sam began, her voice cracking, emotions start to bubble up. Then let us get it out, urged Richard. Let us be honest. The rawness of his insistence echoed in both his voice and the tightly wound emotions in the room. Richard could almost feel the years of neglect unraveling, each confession unbinding knots he thought he could never loosen. As Sam began to speak, revealing more than Richard had expected, heartaches, frustrations, and the despair from her poor decisions, he sensed something neither of them anticipated: hope. This was their chance to engage authentically, yet, as Sam's revelations unfolded, exposing hidden feelings he hadn't been prepared for, Richard realized this conversation was only the beginning. Would Sam hear his side when he shared his own struggles? Would Jake remain patient through the emotional storm? Richard felt the precipice beneath him shift. Conversations with his family were never just about resolving issues, they were a test of his own emotional resilience and willingness to confront the past. Sam, I'm sorry for not being there when you needed me, he finally said, exposing a vulnerability he had long avoided. As he awaited her response, dread and anticipation mingling inside him, he knew the stakes had never felt higher. Unbeknownst to him, both of his children would face not only his truths but the depths of their own unacknowledged emotions, paving the way for revelations they could never have anticipated. In the silence that followed, a question lingered in the air. Would they emerge together, intertwined in understanding, or would the weight of their past sever them further apart as unspoken truths began revealing themselves? The tension in the room hung heavily, the air thick with the unspoken revelations that Richard had feared yet longed for. As he faced Sam, he felt both trepidation and an undercurrent of hope. Their hearts were finally cracking open to something resembling honesty. Dad, I didn't admit how awful I felt about everything because I didn't want to burden you, Sam said. Her voice trembled, but there was strength in her admission, an invitation to explore the raw vulnerabilities they had wallowed in for too long. Each word she spoke wove a tapestry of their shared pain, each thread stitching together the fragments of their dysfunctional bond. Richard took a slow, deep breath, feeling the walls he had built gradually dissolve. It's okay to feel overwhelmed, he reassured her. You're not alone in this. I want to help you navigate through it, but for too long, I thought silence was my only option. I didn't want to intrude. His words, though awkwardly constructed, nudged them toward a river of understanding that flowed beneath the turbulence. He noticed Jake leaning forward, his posture reflecting an eagerness to support his sister, to bridge their collective isolation, and join forces against the unseen adversities they had faced within familial confines. Maybe, Jake interjected, this is what Dad meant when he said we need to face everything together. Mom's absence has cast a long shadow, and we're all hurting because of it. The truth of what Jake said resonated, pain yet proximity. Each unspoken conflict unveiled another layer of grief that had metastasized silently within their family dynamics. Richard saw how they all shared a profound awareness of each other's struggles yet remained unable to address them openly. Let us not just react to Sam's situation, Richard urged, feeling the momentum shift. Let us recalibrate our family's compass. We can't allow the debts and past wounds to continue to define us. Sam wiped away the tears that had spilled, a testament to the emotional pain they had buried for too long. They were all wrestling their individual battles of resentment, regret, and unarticulated needs. I don't want my debt to break our family apart. I never wanted that, she confessed, her voice cracking. We can find a way through this, Richard asserted. I owe it to you both to be an active partner, to risk opening up about my fears as well. The energy in the room shifted, their mutual transparency sowing the seeds for collaboration. They were no longer three individuals wading through each other's burdens. Instead, they were becoming a unified front, ready to tackle challenges without the burden of solitary shame. Should I admit how it's taught me about persistence too? Richard said, taking a moment to recollect his own learning. The grit to get back up, to shift perspectives. What we face doesn't define us. The echoes of his words resonated powerfully. Each member of the family began to relinquish their hidden fears and regrets, spilling them out like a flood meant to wash away their previous inaction. Sam began imagining a new vision of her financial landscape. Could we look at this as a team effort? Maybe we can explore options together? Richard could feel a burgeoning camaraderie, an atmosphere of shared responsibility. Absolutely. If we plan out the approach to your debt, we can tackle it together, he proposed, the excitement of a roadmap that included them all illuminating the way forward. Not to mention, Jake added enthusiastically, we can lean on each other emotionally without the fear of shame. Support goes both ways. Those words rang true as he contemplated their newfound resolve. The stakes felt monumental as he contemplated their first family goal, transparency. They would not merely navigate debts, they would conquer their emotional walls. Richard's pulse quickened as he sensed they were approaching a breakthrough, a pivotal reconstruction of their familial identity. From here on, Richard declared, with a sense of purpose, we face everything together, without secrets. It's time to redefine what being a family looks like. In that defining moment, the energy between them charged with optimism and assurance. This meeting was no longer just about debts or unspoken grief. It had evolved into a pivotal turning point, setting the stage for their growth not merely as individuals but as a cohesive family, stronger together. As they navigated their new vision, Richard felt fulfillment swell within him, the kind that stemmed from authentic connection and shared vulnerability. For so long, he had shunned difficult conversations, retreating into silence. This was the moment he realized he had transformed, standing at the intersection of shared anguish and collective resilience. A sense of deep satisfaction washed over him. He had conquered the fears of confrontation, learned the value of collaboration, and stepped into a role of active support in his own family narrative. Amid stress and sadness, the triumph of communication stood resolute. Richard had finally become not just a father by obligation but a father by intentional engagement, ready to build a familial legacy grounded in understanding, support, and unconditional love. The weight of guilt and regret began to lift as they all shared smiles tinged with hope and affirmation. Richard invited them to delve deeper, emphasizing the importance of sustained dialogues even after the day's meeting concluded. They were not merely redeeming financial woes, they were rediscovering the beauty and openness, the power of being present for one another. This was only the beginning, but they were more than capable of confronting whatever lay ahead. The path of their transformation was paved with conversations, revelations, and the resolute promise to remain engaged. They were ready for what came next, knowing they would always emerge together. Their family bond, solidified in trust, could weather any storm. This realization solidified Richard's sense of self, guaranteeing that he would no longer retreat, but face every chapter of life with an unwavering commitment to uplift one another. The true journey of overcoming had just begun. Subscribe immediately to the channel to not miss the next exclusive emotional stories. Leave a like now to feed the algorithm. Comment your reactions and theories about the ending. Share instantly this video with at least 5 friends who need to see this conclusion. You need to subscribe now. This is the moment to show your support. Don't wait even one more second to share. True fans of personal overcoming stories understand the importance of boosting the channel through these actions.